Hello there, and welcome to this week's Tuesday night Bible study. As you might be aware, we have these each week when the person who delivered the sermon on our live stream service the previous Sunday spends a little bit more time unpacking what they said. And as I spoke last Sunday, it's now my turn, for the first time in fact, to host this Tuesday night Bible study. We are going through Luke's Gospel, and we are doing our encounter series, looking at examples from Luke's account of Jesus' life, of Jesus encountering different people. And as Richard reminded us last week and in previous weeks, the point of this series is for us to look at what it means to be human, what it means to be truly human. And Jesus shows humanity, shows what humanity looks like in God's eyes, because he is fully God and fully human. And so we're learning from him what it means to be more human. So my plan over this evening's session is to recap what I said on Sunday, but to go into a bit more detail, flesh out things a little bit more, and then to leave us with some thoughts around this whole thing of what it means to be more human. So perhaps you're watching this on your own at home or with your family. Maybe you're catching up with this later in the week. Or maybe you're watching this as part of a home group, and you'll be catching up with your home group sometime to discuss this passage. So whoever you are, what you're doing, I hope that this next period of time together, which won't be too long, will be really beneficial to you. My prayer is that God will speak to us as we look at this passage in Luke chapter 6. So as we look at this passage, Luke chapter 6, we need to get back into the mindset of the religious scene of Jesus's day. And that's quite a stretch for us, because we do live in a completely different culture. And so we need to do a little bit of work to try and understand why the controversy, why was Jesus so at fault in the eyes of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So to remind ourselves, the Pharisees challenged Jesus on two things by Luke's account. One is that Jesus' disciples are seen walking through a field and harvesting ears of corn in order to eat. And they're doing this on the Sabbath day. And the Sabbath is a day once a week in the Jewish culture when Jews were supposed to not work, and they were supposed to give that day over to God as a particular special day for worship, for time with family, for enjoying and giving thanks to God for his creation and his provision in their life. And the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the Pharisees were a particular group of religious people who wanted to make sure that people abided by the Sabbath. And in order to do that, they had set up lots of sub-laws to monitor people's behaviour. So in order not to work, you really shouldn't be harvesting in this instant. You really shouldn't even pick one little ear of corn for your own personal satisfaction of your hunger. That's working. So it's really stringent, really strict laws that the Pharisees were implementing. But of course, we have to understand that the Pharisees are doing this out of a desire to serve God. And they saw that Sabbath day was a really important thing. God had given the Sabbath as a gift to his people, one day a week to rest. And so the Pharisees were taking this to extremes. and as we'll discover in a short while, what they were doing was actually leading them down a blind alley. Was actually they're actually wandering off the path of what God meant originally with the Sabbath. So the disciples weren't allowed in the Pharisees' eyes to pick these grains of corn, these ears of corn. And Jesus, as we saw in the passage, counters the Pharisees by looking back at a passage that you can read in the Old Testament, an incident in Israel's history when David, before he was king, was so hungry with his soldiers that he went into a place and ate the sacred bread that was set apart for use by the priests, and he ate the bread and he gave it to his men to eat. And Jesus, in using this example, is saying that was the right thing for King David to do. David was satisfying his hunger by using something that was holy. And so Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, look, my disciples are doing something on a holy day to satisfy their hunger, just like David used something holy to satisfy his hunger. So the disciples are doing exactly what King David did all those years ago. And of course we need to remember that King David is the archetypal king. He is the supreme example of what it means to love and serve God. And the Pharisees agree with that, and so Jesus is being really clever in saying, look, our archetypal leader did this, and my disciples are doing something very similar. So why are you having a go at them? The next incident where Jesus comes up against the Pharisees and this time the teachers of the law is when on another Sabbath he heals a withered hand on a man in the synagogue while he's teaching. And this is an even more bizarre example, certainly to our modern eyes and ears, when we come across this account of the Pharisees having a go at Jesus for doing something that's clearly, as we would see it, really good. He's healing someone. What could possibly be wrong with healing someone? And as I said in my talk on Sunday, I think the best explanation for this is that the Pharisees were classing Jesus as a type of doctor. Jesus had been going around healing people and making people's physical bodies better, in a sort of miraculous version of a doctor, we might say. And doctors could only save life on the Sabbath. They weren't supposed to work. They weren't supposed to give medication or bandage people up or try and set bones and things like that. You as a doctor, you could only save someone's life. Everyone could agree it's good to save life, and so on the Sabbath you can do that. You can save life. But Jesus, in healing this man's hand, is not saving his life. The man could have waited just 24 hours. He'd had his withered hand probably his whole life. Why didn't he just wait 24 hours? Why didn't Jesus wait and then heal him on the following day? But there's something that's really uncomfortable about that way of thinking, isn't it? And Jesus challenges the Pharisees, and he says, look, God is about healing. He's not going to withhold healing for 24 hours. The Sabbath isn't there to prevent God from doing things. God is Lord of the Sabbath. And this brings us to our one of our main points, which is the key phrase, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus, as the Son of Man, is saying that he is Lord of the Sabbath. He is God, and because he is consistent with all that God had done in Israel's history, which is God is a God who provides, God is a God who heals, God is a God that does good. And the original purpose of the Sabbath was to do was for all these things, was so that God's people could enjoy God's goodness. They could enjoy his creation, his provision, and they could enjoy his healing. and restoration in their lives. And Jesus is saying, this is what the Sabbath is about, therefore I'm doing exactly what the Sabbath is about. And that's the issue that Jesus confronts the Pharisees and the teachers of the law on. Because they, unfortunately, ironically, tragically, had ended up, by having these sub-laws to monitor the Sabbath, they had ended up doing the very opposite of what God had intended. They ended up saying, in effect, look, you can't satisfy your hunger on the Sabbath. You can't. If someone's hungry, they cannot be fed. Essentially, that's what they're saying. If someone's injured or ill, needs healing in some way, well, they'll just have to wait. You can't work on someone to restore them, because working breaks the Sabbath. And Jesus is saying, no, that is completely the opposite to what God is about. Of course the Sabbath is about healing. Of course the Sabbath is about satisfying hunger and providing for those in need. And I'm here as the Son of Man, as Lord of the Sabbath, to show you what it's all about, and you're not going to stop me. And thankfully, amazingly, he restores that hand for that man. So by now, hopefully, we're picking up on the idea that Jesus is consistent with the God of the Old Testament. If we put the Sabbath in its rightful place, which is it is there as a blessing from God. It's there about enjoying life, being thankful, helping others, loving others, serving others, spending time with those you love. If we put the Sabbath into that category, rather than a category that says it's about you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that, which is the line that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were taking, then we can see that Jesus is at one. It is God and is at one with the Father and with the Holy Spirit. Jesus shows that God is a consistent God, that God is not complex, is not complicated, that God is not duplicitous in that he's not one of double standards. He doesn't offer something good with one hand and then take it away with the other. Jesus shows that God is not capricious. He's not there to catch us out or to make life miserable for us. God is there fully to give and to be good and to bring goodness, God's goodness, into our lives. And we see that in Jesus, don't we? Jesus is God's full revelation of himself. God hasn't revealed himself in any other way. And God, interestingly, reveals himself as a person, not as a list of laws, not as some values or qualities for us to aspire to, but God reveals himself in a physical person, and that is Jesus. And what does this physical person do? Well, he only ever gives. He is only ever good. And he does all kinds of things. He restores life, he saves life, he heals, he provides food, he celebrates God's goodness, he enjoys God's creation and God's provision. And he shows us what it means to be human. Jesus is fully God and fully human. And so we can begin to unpack what it means to be human for us today. And that's where we're going to go for the rest of this session. What does it mean to be human, particularly in light of this passage today? Well, firstly, Jesus shows us that it is good, whatever day it is, to enjoy his God's creation and to satisfy hunger and to be thankful. And we see that in the first instance through the disciples taking ears of corn on the Sabbath as they walked through a cornfield. And that, I mean, you can probably imagine yourself doing that, couldn't you, on a lovely summer's day, walking through a cornfield and just picking at the corn as you go by, and that is a delightful scene. And so that shows that we are made to delight in God's provision. God has abundantly blessed this earth with food to feed us, and so we can celebrate it and enjoy it, whatever day it is. We can give thanks to God for it and enjoy his creation. And that's very simply what the incident of the disciples walking through the cornfield shows us. The second thing that Jesus shows us about humanity is that we are called to alleviate suffering of others, and we're called to do that as soon as possible, not to withhold goodness from others. And we see this in the example of the man being healed of his withered hand. This man, even though he was a Jew, would have felt excluded from society. All people who had a deformity or a disability were considered second-class citizens, if you like, or worse. He would have probably felt excluded, although it's a good thing that he was attending the synagogue. And so this man really had quite, like many people of his time with a deformity or disability, was in a really difficult social standing. And so when Jesus walks into his life and he heals him just like that on the Sabbath, all these things that he was lacking, he suddenly gets. He gets his hand back, for one. I mean, imagine not being able to use one of your hands. He can use his hand. He's restored to society. He's seen to have God's favour. This rabbi, Jesus, this great teacher who many think is a holy person, is a good person, has healed him. Obviously, Jesus thinks he deserves healing. So therefore, God thinks this man is worthy of healing. And he can work. He can now go out and get a job, whatever that is, and earn a living. And so this man's life is completely turned around. And again, that's another beautiful picture of what it means to be human. Not only does God want the best for us and to restore us, but God wants us to be agents of goodness. He wants us there and then, whatever day it is, to provide, to restore, to heal another human being, whatever that need might be. We're beginning to conclude that the law, the Sabbath law is there to serve God's purposes rather than the other way round. We've seen how the Pharisees, in this instance, think that people on Sabbath at least should go hungry, that they can't gather food, and also that if people want to be well, they have to wait, they have to suffer a little bit longer. Of course, Jesus counteracts those things very strongly, and he is seen to be someone who provides and who heals whatever day is, and actually shows most clearly what the Sabbath is all about, what it has been about all along. And so now in our session we're beginning to turn things around to ourselves and begin to think about, okay, so this is all really, really good stuff, but what does it mean for us today? And of course, forefront in our minds is the lockdown, is the coronavirus pandemic that we are all living through at the moment. And we can see on the news a mixture of great things happening and a mixture of really tragic things happening as well. In terms of provision, we can see people accessing food banks, which is a great thing. We can see in terms of enjoying God's goodness and being thankful, we can see that a lot of people have been given more time for family and time to go out and enjoy creation, time to slow down, time to think, time to enjoy exercise. And these are really, really good things. We've seen our nation pull together, and many instances, countless instances of people doing great things, some real heroes out there, things that we can be thankful for. So much goodness despite the really tragic things going on with the coronavirus. But of course, alongside that, it's the rough with the smooth. We see people really struggling. We see people struggling financially. People are having to access food banks because they don't have enough to eat. We're seeing people, particularly frontline workers and key workers, working lives become almost unbearably difficult. Really difficult situations. We've heard on the news, haven't we, of frontline NHS workers not having enough PPE, protective equipment to keep them safe from the virus. We hear stories of people working long hours, not having time for family, not having time to stop and enjoy creation and God's goodness. And so, as always, humanity is in this sort of mixture of whatever situation we're in as a nation, some really good stuff happening, and some really difficult things as well. And what does that all mean for us? Well, I want to ask us a few questions as we begin to wrap things up. And one is, where in the mix of all this, the good and the bad, the rough and the smooth, can we be light? Very simple question. Jesus stepped into our world, and in Luke chapter 6 we see yet another example of him being light, of revealing God's goodness. And that's a very broad thing, but what does it mean for us? How can we be light during this coronavirus? And that's something we've all been wrestling with as a church over recent weeks. And so you might want to pause now and just have a think about that question. Where in the mix can we be light? My second question is this. After the lockdown, what might we change so that we live more humanly, if I can put it like that? When we have our freedoms restored to us, when the measures are lifted, how might we go out into the world and live more like Jesus? How might we be people who enjoy creation? How might we carve out time and not just go back to busyness? Carve out time to enjoy the wonders of creation, to enjoy food and to enjoy providing food for others, just as the disciples were able to enjoy God's goodness in that cornfield. How might we serve others? I don't know, we feel particularly inspired with all the volunteering that's been going on. Maybe we want to serve in a particular area, maybe a food bank or helping in our local community somehow. How might we serve others to alleviate suffering, just as Jesus alleviated the suffering of that man with the withered hand? In short, it's about this. How can we reflect God's goodness back to God and to others? In being thankful for all that God has given us, we're saying, God, thank you for your goodness. We now give it back to you by spending time, giving our lives just to enjoy the goodness and wonders of your world. But also, how might we reflect God's goodness outwards towards other people? And this might be in our immediate circle, friends and family, people we are in lockdown with, people we communicate with on our street or through social media. But more widely than that, and certainly once lockdown is lifted, how might we love and serve those in our community? How might we go that little extra mile, that little further away from home to actually show Jesus to other people, to show what it means to be human, bearing in mind that Jesus is the one who shows us what it means to be human. So those are some things to chew on, to think about. You might want to, I'm going to wrap things up now, but you might just want to stop, and I'm going to leave us with the question. You might just want to stop and discuss those things, or discuss them later in the week, or with your home group if you're part of one. So it just leaves me to say thank you for joining me on this session. There's so much more that could be said, and I hope I've done justice to the passage, and I hope I've made things clear for us to discuss. As always, do send in your comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you once again, and God bless you.